96-year-old woman versus 1,000 coyotes to save her cow. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. In the vast, arid stretch of the western plains, where the wind howls and the sun scorches everything in sight, there lived a woman who was no stranger to hardship. Her name was Margaret, and she had seen nearly a century of life, filled with both joy and sorrow. At 96, Margaret's life had become a quiet one, tucked away in a small, weathered cabin on a ranch that had once been a thriving place but was now slowly crumbling, just as the world around it seemed to be. Despite her age, she still had a sharp mind, and her hands, though gnarled with age, still knew the rhythm of hard work. She had no family left, and most of the nearby ranchers had long since moved on, leaving her in solitude. Her only companions were the cattle she raised, and of them, one stood out. A beautiful cow she had raised from a calf, the last of her herd. This cow was not just a creature to Margaret. It was a symbol of her enduring strength, a connection to the life she had once lived so vibrantly. One fateful night, the tranquility of her solitary life was shattered. As Margaret sat by the fire, the quiet of the plains was broken by a distant howling. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but then the howls grew louder, more menacing. Coyotes. Thousands of them, it seemed, their calls echoed through the vast emptiness of the land, drawing nearer to her ranch with every passing moment. Margaret stood up slowly, her old bones creaking, but her determination sharp as ever. She had raised cattle in these plains for decades, and she wasn't about to let a pack of coyotes take away the last of her herd. With the moonlight casting eerie shadows across the land, Margaret made her way to the barn, her heart racing but her steps steady. She could hear the coyotes now, their growls and howls growing louder, circling her property. The cow she loved so much was in danger, and Margaret knew that it was up to her to protect it. She grabbed the old rifle that had served her well over the years, the one she hadn't used in many seasons. As she stepped outside, the moon revealed a terrifying sight, a massive pack of coyotes, at least 1,000 strong, closing in on the barn. They moved in a coordinated fashion, their eyes glowing in the dark as they watched her. Margaret's breath quickened, but her resolve never wavered. She wasn't about to let these creatures take her cow. With the rifle in her hands, she steadied her breathing and took her position by the barn door. The coyotes paused, sensing her presence. The standoff was about to begin. As the first coyote lunged forward, Margaret fired, the sound of the shot ringing out across the silent plains. The shot missed, but it did the trick. The coyotes hesitated, unsure of what to do next. Margaret's heart pounded, but she knew she had to stand her ground. She wasn't just fighting for the cow. She was fighting for the memories of her youth, the life she had known, and the piece of herself she had left in this barren land. Every shot she fired sent a message. She wasn't going down without a fight. The coyotes were relentless, but Margaret was unyielding. She fired again and again, each shot ringing out into the night, keeping the creatures at bay. It was a battle of wills, one woman, fierce and determined, against a pack of wild, hungry animals. But Margaret knew she couldn't keep this up forever. The coyotes were many, and she was old. Just as she thought she might be overrun, a change came. The coyotes, sensing the strength of their opponent, began to retreat into the darkness. Margaret's heart raced as she watched them pull back, one by one, vanishing into the night. The battle was won. Her cow was safe. Margaret stood there for a moment, panting, her body trembling from the exertion. She had done it. She had faced the impossible and come out victorious. The coyotes may have been wild and powerful, but Margaret had proven that even at 96, she was not to be underestimated. The plains were quiet again, the danger having passed, but Margaret's spirit remained strong. She walked back to the barn, the cow nuzzling her as if to thank her. For Margaret, it was just another day on the ranch, another day in a long life of hard work, fierce determination, and a love for the land that had never faltered. As the dust settled and the howls of the coyotes grew distant, Margaret stood in the moonlight, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The barn door creaked as the wind whispered through the cracks, but the night had finally calmed. Her cow, once under the threat of 1,000 wild beasts, now stood quietly by her side, grazing peacefully. Margaret's heart still pounded, but the feeling of victory began to sink in. She had done what no one, not even the young ranchers in the valley, could have done. At 96, she had faced down an army of coyotes and won. The morning would come soon, and with it, the calm that followed every battle. But there was no time for rest. Margaret knew that she had won this battle, but there were more challenges ahead, and not all of them were as easily fought as coyotes in the night. She gathered the rifle she had left lying on the ground, her hands still steady from the adrenaline that flowed through her veins. The sun would rise soon, and she needed to make sure the cow was safe, but she also knew that the victory she had won tonight was more than just a physical one. It was a reminder to herself that she still had the strength to fight, to protect what was hers, even in the twilight of her years. Margaret turned back toward the barn, wiping her brow with the sleeve of her worn blouse. Her fingers brushed against the silver locket that hung around her neck, a memento from her late husband. It had been a gift from him on their wedding day, and she often found herself holding it in times of need. Tonight was no exception. She whispered a quiet prayer to herself, thanking her late husband for the strength he had given her all those years ago. As she stepped back inside the barn, the cow gave a soft moo, the only sound that seemed to break the silence. Margaret leaned against the post, taking a moment to reflect on what she had just accomplished. There was no one else to share the victory with. Her children were grown and far away, and her friends had long since moved on. But Margaret didn't mind. She had always been a solitary soul, content with the rhythm of the land and the animals she cared for. She had built this life with her own hands, and tonight, she had defended it. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a golden light over the plains. Margaret stood in the doorway of the barn, her eyes scanning the horizon. She knew that life would continue, and that more challenges would come. But for now, she allowed herself to rest in the knowledge that, at least for one night, she had proven to herself and the world that even the oldest and most fragile could fight for what they loved. As the morning light broke through the horizon, Margaret walked out of the barn and down to the creek. She filled a bucket with water, the cool liquid a welcome relief after the long night. She paused for a moment, taking in the beauty of the land she had spent her life cultivating. The trees swayed in the breeze, and the birds chirped in the distance. This was her world, her sanctuary. The fight against the coyotes had been fierce, but it was just another part of the journey. Margaret had lived through the hard times and the good, and she had always come out on the other side stronger. As she returned to the barn, she noticed something different. The cow was no longer alone. A small herd of cattle, from the neighboring ranch, had wandered onto her property. It was an unusual sight. There had been no cattle nearby for years. Margaret froze for a moment, unsure of what to make of it. But then, as the realization hit her, she smiled. The neighbors had heard the shots. They had come to check on her, to see if she needed help. Margaret had spent so many years working alone, it was strange to see anyone else. She walked over to the herd, her hand gently stroking the cow's back. She was no longer alone in this fight. She had proven herself, and now, the land, the animals, and even the neighbors recognized her strength. Margaret was no longer just the old woman living on the edge of the plains. She was a force to be reckoned with, a symbol of resilience in a world that often left the weak behind. And with that, she knew that no matter what the future held, she was ready. She had faced 1,000 coyotes and won. What else could life possibly throw at her? The next few days passed quietly for Margaret, her world once again calm after the chaos of the coyote attack. The sun shone bright and steady, warming the land that she had come to know so well. But though the plains seemed peaceful, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The presence of the neighboring cattle was no accident. She had lived on these plains long enough to know when someone was watching from the shadows. And sure enough, when the morning fog had cleared, a lone figure stood at the edge of her property. Margaret's sharp eyes recognized the man instantly. It was Ben, a young rancher who had recently moved to the valley, the kind of man who preferred to keep to himself. He hadn't spoken much when he had passed through the area a few weeks earlier, but Margaret had noticed the way his eyes lingered on her land. She had also heard rumors that he was struggling with his own ranch, much like she had been years ago. Ben stood at the fence, watching her as she walked to the barn, his expression unreadable. Margaret's instincts told her that he wasn't here for a friendly chat. She paused for a moment, weighing her options. She had been alone for so long, and a part of her was grateful for the presence of someone else. But another part of her, the one that had survived decades of hardship, knew better than to let her guard down too easily. With a deep breath, she walked towards him, the weight of the rifle on her shoulder a comforting reminder of the battle she had fought and won only days before. As she approached, Ben tipped his hat, his eyes flickering with something between respect and wariness. "Margaret," he said, his voice rough like gravel. "I heard what happened. Thought I'd come by to check on you." Margaret nodded, her face betraying little emotion. She knew that the news of the coyote attack had spread fast. She wasn't surprised that Ben had heard about it. After all, news traveled quickly in the valley, especially when a woman like her, at 96, managed to fight off a pack of wild animals. "I'm fine," Margaret replied, her voice steady. "The cow is fine too." Ben's eyes dropped to the ground for a moment, his shoulders shifting with some unspoken weight. "That cow's lucky," he muttered. "Not many would have stood their ground like you did." Margaret raised an eyebrow, her lips twitching into a slight smile. "I've had to fight for what I have, Ben. I'm not about to let anything take it from me." Ben nodded, his gaze lingering on the barn behind her. "I know how you feel. Things haven't been easy for me either. My ranch is struggling, and I'm running out of options." Margaret studied him closely, her sharp mind analyzing his every word, his every gesture. She could see the exhaustion in his face, the weight of his burdens pressing down on him. She had been there once, decades ago, when she had to fight just to keep the land her family had built. "What do you want from me?" Margaret asked, her voice cutting through the air like a knife. Ben shifted uncomfortably, but held her gaze. "I don't know," he admitted. "I thought maybe we could help each other out. I've got cattle, but I need some more land to graze them. You've got land, but you don't have enough cattle. Maybe we could strike a deal." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly as she considered his words. It was an offer, but it was one that carried weight. Helping him meant giving up part of her hard-earned space, and Margaret didn't make decisions lightly. She had fought too hard to keep what was hers to just hand it over to someone who was looking for a quick fix to his problems. "I've worked this land for my whole life, Ben," she said slowly, her voice firm. "I didn't get here by making deals with strangers, but I'm not without mercy either." She paused for a moment, watching him carefully. "I'll help you, but it's not for free. You'll work with me, not against me. If you want something from me, you'll have to prove you're worth it." Ben's face lit up with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "You've got a deal?" "Margaret." Margaret nodded, a faint smile curling at the edges of her lips. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't alone anymore. The land she had fought for was hers, but the people in her life were what truly made her strong. And just like that, the cycle of life on the plains continued. With each passing day, Margaret found herself growing a little less alone, a little more connected to the world around her. The future was uncertain, but Margaret knew she was ready for whatever came her way. The days that followed brought a sense of normalcy to Margaret's life, though she was keenly aware that the peace she now enjoyed might be fleeting. Ben had proven to be a reliable partner, though quiet and reserved, much like she had been when she first arrived in these harsh plains decades ago. He worked hard, tending to his cattle and helping her with the upkeep of the land. There was an unspoken understanding between them. Each of them was in this together, but each still maintained their own solitude. It wasn't long before Ben began to confide in Margaret, speaking of the struggles he faced since he arrived in the valley. His family had once been successful ranchers, but their land was lost to debt, forcing him to start over. Margaret could hear the bitterness in his voice when he spoke of his father's failure to keep the ranch afloat, the way the family had once been proud of their land, only to watch it slip away. She knew those feelings all too well. Margaret had never been one to dwell on the past, but she could sense that Ben was carrying a heavy burden. One morning, as they worked together on a fence line near the river, he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'll ever get back what my family lost. It feels like everything I do, I'm just chasing something that's already gone." Margaret paused, leaning on the wooden post she was securing. Her eyes wandered to the horizon, where the sun began to rise. casting a warm glow over the land she had spent so many years nurturing. She didn't respond right away, but when she did, her voice was soft, yet firm. Ben, you may never get back what your family lost, but that doesn't mean you've lost everything. You've got this land, and you've got your cattle. That's more than most people have. You're still here, and that means something. Ben didn't speak for a moment, the silence hanging between them. Then he nodded, his eyes meeting hers for the first time since their conversation started. I've been so focused on what I lost, I forgot to see what I still have. Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with a quiet sense of pride. It wasn't often that people truly understood the value of what they had, but Ben was beginning to see it. The days turned into weeks, and soon the bond between them grew stronger. They worked side by side, sharing stories of their pasts, their hardships, and their dreams for the future. Margaret found herself opening up in ways she hadn't in years, and Ben began to trust her more than he had with anyone else. One evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Ben approached Margaret as she sat on the porch of the cabin, her hands resting on her knees. I've been thinking, he said, his voice serious. Margaret looked up, sensing that this was no ordinary conversation. About the cattle. About this land, he continued. I think we can do more with it than we're doing now. We can grow, we can expand. I don't want to keep going in circles, wondering what could have been. I want to build something real, something that lasts. Margaret studied him for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. She could see the fire in his eyes, the same determination that had once driven her to create the ranch she had now. She understood his desire for something lasting, something that could stand the test of time. You're right, she said quietly. We can do more. But it's not just about the cattle or the land. It's about what we're willing to put into it, what we're willing to fight for. You can't build something real if you're only looking at the past. You have to look forward. Ben nodded, his expression softening. I understand now, he said, his voice steady. I'm ready to look forward. Ready to make this work. The next few months were filled with hard work and determination. Ben and Margaret put everything they had into the ranch, expanding their herd, improving the land, and building a future they could both be proud of. It wasn't easy, but they were determined. Margaret had found a sense of purpose again, something she hadn't realized she was missing. As the days passed, she found herself less and less alone. Ben had become more than just a neighbor or a fellow rancher. He had become a friend, someone she could trust and rely on. One morning, as the sun rose over the plains, Margaret stood on the porch, looking out at the land they had built together. The cattle grazed peacefully in the field, the barns stood strong and sturdy, and the valley stretched out before them, full of promise. We've come a long way, Ben said, standing beside her. Margaret nodded, a smile tugging at her lips. We have, and we'll keep going. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt ready to face it. With Ben by her side, she knew she was no longer fighting alone. The months that followed were filled with the steady rhythm of life on the ranch. The land, which had once seemed barren and empty, was now alive with the sounds of cattle and the hum of hard work. Ben and Margaret had built something solid, a foundation that was beginning to thrive. The days were long, the work never-ending, but there was a satisfaction in it that both of them had longed for. They worked side by side, each bringing their strengths to the table. Ben, with his youthful energy and ideas, was the force that pushed them forward, while Margaret, with her wisdom and experience, was the anchor that kept them grounded. Together, they made a great team. But even with all their progress, the past was never far behind. One afternoon, as Margaret was tending to the cattle near the far end of the property, she noticed a rider approaching in the distance. At first, she thought it was just one of the neighbors, but as the rider drew closer, she recognized the familiar gait of the horse. It was Marshal Voss, the local sheriff. He had been a frequent visitor in the past, always bringing bad news or asking for something. Margaret's hand tightened around the reins of her horse as she waited for him to approach. She knew this wouldn't be a friendly visit. Marshal pulled up in front of her, his face grim, as usual. He tipped his hat, but it was clear he wasn't here for pleasantries. Margaret, he said, his voice heavy. I need to speak with you. What is it, Marshal? Margaret replied, her tone sharp. It's about your land, he began, his eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for the right words. There's been talk around town. Some people say you're sitting on valuable land. Land that could be used for something bigger, something more profitable. Margaret narrowed her eyes, her suspicion growing. She had worked this land for most of her life, and she knew better than anyone the value it held. But she also knew that people in town were always looking for ways to take what wasn't theirs. I'm not interested in selling, Margaret said firmly, her voice steady. This land has been in my family for generations. It's not for sale. Marshall paused for a moment, then leaned forward in his saddle, lowering his voice. I didn't come here to ask you to sell, Margaret, but I'm afraid you might not have a choice. Margaret felt a cold chill run through her at his words. She had seen the way people in town looked at her property, the way they eyed the land she had worked so hard to maintain. It was no secret that the valley was changing, that new money and new families were moving in, hoping to stake their claim. What are you talking about? Margaret asked, her voice growing colder. There's a developer, Marshall continued, a man named Gregory Landon. He's been buying up land around here for months, and he's got his eyes on yours. He's got a plan, a big one. A plan that involves turning this valley into something bigger. Margaret's mind raced. She had heard whispers of developers buying land, of plans to turn the valley into a sprawling resort or town. She had fought too hard to protect her way of life, her ranch, to let it be swallowed up by greed. You're telling me you're going to let them take this land? Margaret said, her voice rising with anger. You're the sheriff. You should be protecting it, not handing it over. Marshall shifted uncomfortably in his saddle, but his gaze never wavered. I'm just telling you what's coming, Margaret. I don't have much say in it. The town council has already given Landon the green light. All I'm asking is that you think carefully. There might be something in it for you, something that could make the future a little easier. Margaret stood there for a moment, her eyes fixed on Marshall. The words he had spoken hit her like a punch in the stomach. She had always known that change was inevitable, but this was something different. They weren't just talking about growth. They were talking about taking away everything she had worked for. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. She had spent so many years protecting this land, building it up from nothing. She wasn't about to let it be stolen from her, no matter what promises were made. I don't want anything from you, Marshall, Margaret said, her voice low but firm. This land is mine, and I'll fight for it, just like I always have. Marshall nodded slowly, understanding that there was no changing her mind. I thought you might say that, he said. But be careful. There are powerful people behind this, people who won't take no for an answer. I just wanted you to know what's coming. With that, he turned his horse and rode off, leaving Margaret standing alone in the field. The wind swept through the tall grass, but Margaret stood still, her mind racing. She had faced so many battles in her life, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about her ranch anymore. It was about standing up against something bigger, something more powerful. And for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of uncertainty creep into her heart. She had always been able to fight for what she believed in, but this time, the stakes were higher. She wasn't sure if she was ready for what was coming next, but one thing was clear. She wasn't going down without a fight. Margaret stood in the fields long after Marshall had left, her mind swirling with thoughts of the impending changes. She had worked her whole life to build something solid, something that had withstood the tests of time, but now, the very foundation of her life was under threat. The winds whispered through the tall grass, carrying the promise of change, change that Margaret had not asked for and did not want. Yet, as much as she resisted, she knew deep down that she could not ignore what was coming. She had spent years living in solitude, hiding from the world, but now the world was knocking at her door. She had spent her youth battling the elements, the coyotes, and the challenges that came with living on the land, and she had always come out victorious. But this was something different. This wasn't just a battle for her ranch. It was a battle for everything she had fought for, everything she had ever believed in. Margaret's eyes narrowed as she thought about the man behind the plan, Gregory Landon. He was not like the others who had come and gone from the valley. He was powerful, connected, and ruthless. The kind of man who didn't take no for an answer. She knew that he wasn't just interested in her land. He was after control. He wanted to reshape the valley in his image, and that meant wiping out everything in his path, including people like her. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret's thoughts turned to Ben. He had been a solid partner, but she knew that the challenges ahead would test both of them in ways they hadn't experienced before. She couldn't do this alone. No matter how much she wanted to hold on to her independence, she realized that this time, she needed help. The next morning, Margaret made her way to Ben's cabin. She found him standing outside, staring at the horizon, much like she had the day before. The weight of the situation had begun to settle on his shoulders, just as it had on hers. He turned when he heard her approach, his expression somber. "I heard about Landon," he said, his voice low. "I'm not going to let him take this from us, Margaret." Margaret gave him a long look, her eyes softening. "I know, but it's not just about the land. He's got more power than we do, more money, and that's something we can't fight on our own." Ben's jaw tightened, and he took a step closer to her. "We don't have to fight him alone. You've built this place, and I've got your back. Together, we can stop him." Margaret shook her head slightly. "I appreciate that, Ben. But this is bigger than just us. We need to rally the others. We need the whole valley to stand with us." Ben's eyes flashed with determination. "Then let's do it. We'll bring everyone together. The ranchers, the farmers. If they want to take our land, they'll have to go through all of us." Margaret studied him for a moment, then nodded. Ben was right. If they were going to stand a chance against Landon, they couldn't do it alone. It was time to bring the people together. The next few days were spent riding from ranch to ranch, speaking with the others who lived in the valley. Some were hesitant, unsure if they could stand up to someone as powerful as Landon. Others were more willing to listen, ready to take a stand for what was rightfully theirs. Margaret's reputation preceded her, and soon, more and more ranchers began to rally behind her. It wasn't an easy task, but Margaret was used to hard work. And with Ben by her side, they managed to unite the valley. The plan was simple. They would not let Landon take the land. If it meant standing together and fighting for what was right, then that's what they would do. As the days passed, the group grew stronger. News spread quickly, and more ranchers and farmers joined their cause. By the time they were ready to face Landon, the valley had become a united front, standing together against the man who thought he could buy them all out. Margaret stood at the front of the group, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. She had never done anything like this before, but she knew one thing. This was her home, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her. The day they finally confronted Gregory Landon was the hottest of the summer. The air hung thick with tension as they rode to the meeting place, a field just outside the valley. Landon was already there, surrounded by his men, their faces cold and calculating. But as Margaret and her group rode in, something shifted. Landon's confident smile faltered, just for a second, as he saw the numbers on the horizon. The people of the valley had come together, and they were ready to fight for what was theirs. Margaret's heart raced as she looked out at the sea of people who had come to stand with her. She had spent her life on this land, fighting for survival. But now, she was fighting for something even more important, the future. She wasn't going to let it slip away without a fight. The confrontation between Margaret and Gregory Landon was a test of wills. As the dust settled and the valley's people gathered around, a tense silence filled the air. Margaret stood at the front, her posture strong and unwavering, while Ben and the others flanked her, their faces grim but resolute. Landon, with his slick suit and polished boots, stood a few yards away, his eyes scanning the crowd. He had a smug look on his face, as though he expected this to be another negotiation that he would win with ease. But the people of the valley weren't going to back down. Margaret could feel the weight of their eyes on her. They had put their trust in her, and now it was time for her to prove she could lead them through this fight. Landon took a step forward, his voice cutting through the quiet. "I don't know what you're all expecting to accomplish here," he said, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "This land isn't worth the trouble you're making. You can't hold on to it forever. You're all just delaying the inevitable." Margaret stepped forward, her voice steady, but strong. "You don't know us, Landon. You don't understand what it means to fight for something that's yours. This land has been in our families for generations. We're not going to let you take it without a fight." Landon raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "A fight? You think a few farmers and ranchers can stand up to me? I have the resources, the connections, and the money to buy you all out, and I will." Margaret's heart raced, but she held her ground. She knew this wasn't just about her land anymore. It was about the future of the valley, about preserving the way of life they had all built here. "You may have money, but we have something you can't buy," Margaret said, her voice ringing out. "We have each other. We have the strength of this valley, and we have the resolve to keep it." And that, Landon, is something you will never have. There was a murmur from the crowd, a ripple of agreement that ran through the valley's people. Landon's smirk faltered for a moment as he looked at the determined faces around him. He had expected fear, or at least hesitation, but instead, he was met with unity. Margaret could see the change in him. The once confident developer was now second-guessing his position, trying to read the room, looking for any weakness he could exploit. He looked over his shoulder at his men, then back at Margaret. "You really think you can stop me?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "I can get the law on my side. I'll make sure your resistance is crushed." Margaret stepped even closer, her eyes locked on his. "The law may be on your side, but we've got the truth on ours," she said, her words cutting through the tension like a blade. "The people here know what's right, and we will stand by it, no matter what." Ben, who had been standing quietly beside her, now spoke up. "Landon, you've underestimated us. You've underestimated Margaret. She's fought harder battles than this, and she's never backed down. You won't intimidate us with your money and power." Landon's expression darkened, his jaw tightening in frustration. The situation was slipping from his control, and he knew it. He had come here expecting to buy them out, to force them into submission, but now he was facing something he didn't know how to handle. For the first time, he felt outnumbered, outmatched, and unsure. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low, almost threatening. "You can't win this fight." Margaret's gaze never wavered. "We'll see about that," she replied calmly. "You're not going to take our land. Not without a fight." With that, she turned to the crowd behind her, who were now visibly bracing for the battle ahead. There was no turning back now. The valley had chosen its side, and they weren't going to let Landon's greed destroy everything they had built. The battle lines were drawn. Margaret knew that the coming days would be filled with challenges, but she also knew that they had a chance to protect what was rightfully theirs. The wind blew through the valley, carrying with it the scent of change. The people of the valley stood tall, united in their determination to defend their way of life. Margaret's heart swelled with pride as she looked at them. They weren't just fighting for land, they were fighting for their home, for their families, and for their future. This was a fight they were ready to win. The days after their confrontation with Gregory Landon were tense, as the entire valley held its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Margaret stood at the head of the valley's unified front, her spirit unwavering, but the weight of what lay ahead pressed on her. The ranchers, farmers, and every family who had joined her cause now had to prepare for what could be a long, drawn-out fight. Gregory Landon wasn't going to back down. He had money, connections, and the legal power to push his agenda. But Margaret had something he didn't, a community that would stand together. As she rode through the valley, speaking to the others, she could feel the strength in numbers. The determination of the people was palpable. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the valley's future. The battle they were about to fight wasn't just physical. It would be a battle of wills, of courage, and of enduring what was to come. Margaret knew that. As the days passed, the tension only grew. Landon's men started to appear more frequently on the outskirts of the valley, always watching, always waiting. Margaret, however, didn't flinch. She made her rounds to the neighboring ranches, making sure that everyone was prepared. They knew what was at stake, and she trusted them to do their part. One evening, as the sun began to set and the shadows lengthened across the land, a rider appeared on the horizon. Margaret knew immediately it was Ben. He had been out surveying the property, ensuring the herd was safe and the fences secure. She watched as he rode up to the porch of her cabin, his face serious, but there was something different in his eyes, something that made Margaret pause. "What is it?" she asked, her voice steady, though she could sense the unease in his presence. Ben dismounted slowly, taking a deep breath before he spoke. "It's Landon. He's not just trying to buy us out anymore. He's going for something bigger." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, fear creeping into her chest. "He's got a team of surveyors out there. They're marking land. They're not just buying us out, Margaret. They're planning to bulldoze the valley and turn it into a resort. I saw them. They've already begun mapping out the area, and it's clear they plan to take everything. Our land, our homes, the animals, it's all in their way." The words hit her like a wave, crashing over her with a force she hadn't expected. Margaret felt her blood run cold. She had known that Landon's intentions weren't purely about money, but to hear it put so plainly shook her to her core. "We have to stop them," Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly, but her resolve solid. "We can't let them do this. This valley belongs to us. It always has." Ben nodded, his jaw tightening. "We've got the people, Margaret. We've got the strength to fight this, but it's going to take more than just words. We need to take action. If we wait any longer, it'll be too late." Margaret nodded, knowing that he was right. There wasn't time to waste. The next morning, she gathered the valley's people once again. They met in the center of town, their faces grim but filled with purpose. Margaret stood before them, her presence commanding, and spoke to them with the kind of clarity she had always had in times of crisis. "Landon is trying to take everything from us," she began. "He's not just threatening our land. He's threatening our way of life. He wants to turn this valley into something we've never known, something we can't recognize. But I know one thing. We will not let him. This land is ours, and we will fight for it." There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd, but Margaret could see the fear in their eyes. They knew what they were up against, but they also knew what they stood to lose. "We don't have the money to fight his legal team," Margaret continued. "But we have something he doesn't: unity. We are a community, and together, we will make sure that Landon knows that he's not welcome here. We'll fight him with everything we've got. This is our home, and we won't let him take it." The crowd erupted into applause, the fear slowly melting away as the people rallied behind her. They were ready to fight, not just for the land, but for each other. Margaret could feel the weight lift from her shoulders. She wasn't alone. They weren't alone. Over the next few days, the valley's people began to prepare for the battle ahead. They fortified their homes, strengthened their ties with each other, and worked together like never before. Margaret could see the spirit of unity growing stronger by the day. Ben had been organizing patrols along the perimeter, keeping a sharp eye out for Landon's men. Everyone had a role to play, and everyone was doing their part. As the days turned into weeks, the valley's resolve only grew. They had their plan. They had their community. And now, they had something else that was more valuable than anything Landon could buy: hope. Margaret stood at the edge of the valley one evening, looking out over the land she had fought for her whole life. She had faced down wild coyotes, a changing world, and now the greed of a man who thought he could take everything from her. But she wasn't done yet. She wasn't going to let him win. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting a golden light over the land, Margaret knew that this fight wasn't just about the land. It was about the heart of the valley, the people who lived there, and the future they would create together. And no matter what happened next, she would never stop fighting for it. As the weeks passed, the tension in the valley reached its peak. Margaret had done everything she could to rally the people together, to make them believe in the fight they were taking on. They were united, and that gave her strength. But even with all the preparation and resolve, a part of her still wondered if they could truly win against someone like Gregory Landon. The days grew hotter, the air thick with anticipation, and as the sun rose one final time before the showdown, Margaret felt a deep sense of resolve settle over her. This was it. This was the fight that would determine the future of the valley. The valley's people were gathered, their faces set with determination, their spirits high despite the uncertainty of the coming battle. The air was thick with the scent of dust and sweat, and the fields were quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Ben stood beside her, his eyes scanning the horizon. "It's time," he said, his voice calm but filled with the weight of what they were about to face. Margaret nodded. "We've come too far to back. Down now." As the morning light broke over the valley, the sound of horses' hooves echoed in the distance. Landon's men were coming. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't flinch. She had prepared for this moment for years, and now it was time to stand firm. The people of the valley had gathered at the edge of the land they were fighting to protect. They stood tall, shoulder to shoulder, ready to face whatever came their way. They were no longer just a collection of individuals. They were a unified force, fighting for their future, for their home. As Landon's men arrived, their faces cold and determined, they were met by the unwavering resolve of the valley's people. The sight of so many standing together, ready to defend what was theirs, was enough to give even Landon pause. Margaret stepped forward, her gaze locking with Landon's. "This is our land," she said, her voice carrying the weight of everything she had fought for. "And we're not going to let you take it." Landon's smile was cold, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. "You're outnumbered," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You can't win this fight." Margaret stood taller, her voice steady and firm. "We've already won," she said. "We may not have the money or the power that you do, but we have something more. We have the land, the people, and the will to fight for it. And that's more than you can ever buy." The air crackled with tension as the two sides faced off, neither willing to back down. For a moment, there was silence. And then, just as Margaret thought the situation might boil over, something unexpected happened. One by one, the ranchers and farmers from the valley stepped forward, their eyes filled with determination. "We stand with you, Margaret," Ben said, his voice strong and unwavering. "This is our fight too." The crowd behind her murmured in agreement, and Margaret could feel the collective strength of the valley building, swelling like a rising tide. Landon's men looked at each other, the doubt in their eyes growing. They had expected fear, submission, but instead, they were met with the unshakable resolve of a community that was ready to defend their way of life. Landon's expression faltered for a moment, and in that brief hesitation, Margaret saw the opportunity. "You may have the law on your side, Landon," she said, her voice clear and steady. "But we have something stronger. We have the truth, and we're not afraid to fight for it." Landon opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, one of his men stepped forward, a look of uncertainty on his face. "Are we really going to fight them?" the man asked, his voice wavering. "This is a whole community. They're not just going to roll over." The doubt was spreading among Landon's men, and Margaret saw her chance. "It's not too late, Landon," she said, her voice carrying across the field. "You can walk away now. You can leave us in peace. We'll rebuild, we'll thrive, and you can go back to whatever it is you've been doing. Or you can continue with this fight and watch as you lose everything." The silence stretched on for a long moment, and then Landon's smirk slowly faded. He looked at his men, who were now looking back at him with uncertainty. And then, with a flick of his wrist, he nodded. "We're leaving," he said, his voice begrudging. "This isn't over, but for now, we're done." And just like that, the battle was over. Landon's men turned and rode away, defeated without a single shot fired. Margaret stood there, her heart racing, but a sense of relief washing over her. The valley had won. It wasn't the way she had imagined the battle would end, but it was the victory they had all fought for. The people of the valley cheered, their voices rising in unison as they realized that they had just protected their home. Margaret looked around at the faces of the people she had fought beside, the people she had come to love like family. They weren't just survivors of the land. They were a testament to the power of unity, of fighting for what was right, no matter the odds. And as the sun began to set, casting a golden light over the valley, Margaret knew that this fight, this victory, would go down in history as the moment when the people of the valley stood tall and refused to let their land be taken. They had won. And with that victory came a new beginning, one that they would build together, side by side.